In her own apartment, a young lady was discovered dead. Police launched an investigation, but they turned up no leads. Before a breakthrough in the case was eventually achieved, it took 40 years. But in addition to the truth, detectives also learned new concerning information. On March 30th, 1960, in the state of Virginia, Robin Brooks was born. She moved to the small town of Highland in New York as a child, along with her family. Robin was a happy, outgoing individual who had a large circle of friends and was always able to find common ground with others. She was very close to her older sister Maria as well. Following graduation, Robin chose to relocate to California. The young woman had another important reason for moving besides the fact that the state's climate intrigued her. Robin chose to follow her sister, who had gone there not long before. The young lady found employment in Sacramento after moving into an apartment. She was given the chance to relocate to a residential complex where her sister and her boyfriend resided a few months later. Not only were the apartments noticeably better, but Robin was also able to spend more time with Maria, and she made the decision to move just before turning 20. The young woman had to work 2 jobs to pay the rent for her separate apartment. Within walking distance of her apartment complex was a donut shop where she worked as a cashier. In order to combine it with her second job, Robin opted for the evening shift. For approximately 1.5 months, the young lady resided in this complex and made a lot of friends at work and outside of it. She was happy to be able to see her sister on a daily basis once more. Robin was scheduled to begin her shift at the donut shop at 4 p.m. on April 24, 1980, but her co-workers were shocked when she failed to show up. She never missed a shift while working there, and she frequently arrived even earlier than expected, so this was extremely unusual. After waiting for several hours, one of the staff members made the decision to visit Robin's apartment. When the colleague knocked on the door, nothing happened. There was just silence. After several unsuccessful attempts, he returned back and informed them that the young woman was not responding. Colleagues were quite alarmed by this information, since they assumed that if Robin had not called to explain why she could not make it to work, something might have happened to her. She had made friends with every employee in the short time she had been at their store, and they genuinely cared about her well-being. Co-workers thought about phoning the police, but they soon found out that they would not look for Robin just because she missed a shift. Then one of them made an unconventional suggestion. He offered to open her apartment's front door to see if she was all right. He went to her house with some colleagues, and after a few minutes of knocking on the door, they decided to break in. When they succeeded, they were met with a startling sight. Everything in the living room was covered in blood as Robin lay there on her waterbed. Her colleagues called the police right away, and when they arrived, they were able to confirm the young woman's death. Her body was covered in multiple stab wounds that appeared to have been caused by an unidentified attacker who stabbed her with a knife and repeatedly punctured the waterbed, spilling its contents onto the ground. The police determined, upon reviewing the crime scene, that until Robin's associates opened the entrance door, there were no indications of a break-in. They thought the murderer had broken in through a window because the back door was likewise locked from the inside. Fingerprints on the windowsill were soon discovered by forensic experts, providing credence to this theory. Medical examiners found that the victim had been sexually raped and had acquired biological material from the offender. Additionally, there are small amounts of blood in the apartment that do not match Robin's blood type. After coming to the conclusion that the murderer had cut himself during the assault, investigators sent blood samples to a lab. Unfortunately, they were unable to use this evidence in the 1980s because DNA analysis was not yet available. Starting with her co-workers, investigators interviewed the victim's acquaintances. They claimed that the young woman had left for home the previous day after her shift ended at midnight. She was joking around and acting normally. Nothing at that point suggested that something was wrong. One interesting fact that Robin's co-workers brought up was that she had washed her bedding the day before and was concerned about it drying in time before her return home. Detectives concluded that the victim was attacked shortly after returning home because the bed in her apartment had not been made. Her sister brought up a concerning observation as well. Robin had mentioned being followed by a man a few days prior to her passing. She claimed that this man had visited her store multiple times and had behaved strangely in an attempt to win her affection, but she did not offer any information that would help identify him. But Robin did not take it seriously because he had done nothing to cause her to worry about her safety. Because there were no distinguishing features, the police were unable to identify this individual. They spoke with the victim's neighbors and carried out more investigation, but they were unable to find any leads. That night, none of them heard any screams or sounds of struggle. Additionally, the neighbors did not witness any strangers paying the victim a visit. Investigators also discovered that Robin did not leave work that evening directly for home. She briefly attended a party with her friends before leaving. Her friends claimed that she left the party alone and that there were no awkward moments or confrontations. After speaking with everyone present, the police came to the conclusion that they were most likely not responsible for her death. The investigation eventually came to a standstill. There were no possible suspects. Robin had good relationships with her neighbors and co-workers. She did not have a boyfriend, and she did not know anyone from her past who would have wanted her to suffer. At the time, biological and blood samples were unable to identify the murderer, and matching fingerprints to already existing databases produced no hits. Robin had mentioned a frequent customer of the store, and investigators thought that person was the murderer. Based on their theory, the man tracked the victim from her place of employment to her residence, obtaining her precise address. He waited for her the next day while she was at the store, breaking in through a window into her apartment. He attacked Robin when she got home, brutalized and killed her, and then ran away. Even with no evidence at all, the investigation went on for a while before coming to a standstill. 24 years after the murder, the investigation was finally reopened in 2004. At that point, DNA analysis was a commonly employed technique, and investigators were hopeful that it would aid in identifying the murderer. They send biological material and blood to a lab where specialists take a DNA profile and enter it into the FBI database, but they are unable to find any matches. This indicated that the murderer was either not a repeat offender or that the crime was committed before mandatory DNA collection for such offenders. Still, investigators were met with a disturbing finding in the California State Database. 3 weeks prior to Robin's demise, another crime was committed that the killer's DNA profile matched. At that moment, a mystery man had broken into the house of another young lady, raped her, and then left her unharmed. The young woman did not see the attacker's face because it was all at night. After she called the police right away, forensic specialists were able to take the man's biological material. In an attempt to finally identify Robin's killer, detectives searched for fresh leads in this case, but all of their efforts were fruitless. Investigators were eventually left to periodically cross-reference the DNA profile with databases in the unlikely event that the killer came to light and his DNA was added to existing databases when the case ultimately went cold again. This persisted until 2017, when investigators learned about a novel technique known as DNA phenotyping. In essence, genetics specialists examine a DNA sample and, using their interpretation of the data, approximate a suspect's profile. This is not an exact method, rather it is an additional police guideline. Investigators can examine closely at suspects who are similar to one another or remove someone from the list with the aid of such a portrait. Investigators resorted to Parabon nanolabs, which carried out similar studies, and they quickly created a rough sketch of the murderer. He turned out to be an African-American man. But among all the people who even vaguely appeared in the case, investigators could not find anyone who looked similar. 2 portraits were created by Parabon Nanolabs. One depicted the suspect's potential appearance in 1980 and the other in 2017. In an effort to generate fresh leads, the media released both photos. Robin's family members also hoped to learn the truth at last. Thus, they made the decision to offer a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the location of this individual. The police got a number of tips, but none of them produced any results. They never did find out who the real criminal was. Nevertheless, the detectives and Robin's family members were not going to give up. This case was added to the list of unsolved homicides in 2020 for which funding was increased. By then, a new DNA analysis tool was under active use that made it possible to find the DNA sample owner's distant relatives. In order for this to happen, at least one kinship relative of his needed to be listed in state or public DNA databases. After delivering the Robin's killer sample to the Parabon Nanolabs experts, they waited. It took them several months to research the criminal's potential relatives, follow their family trees, and identify a credible suspect. The detectives were able to obtain a name at last. Philip Wilson, who was 71 years old at the time, but the findings of the study did not support his guilt. It was imperative that the police obtain his DNA and compare it to the sample discovered in the victim's apartment. After finding out this man's address, they started keeping an eye on him. Given that it is not legally required for someone to give a sample of their DNA, the police must use some creative tactics. They frequently make an effort to obtain something that the suspect may have touched. It could be a cigarette butt, a water bottle, or anything else. After obtaining everything they required, investigators turned the sample of DNA over to specialists. In Wilson's case, investigators proceeded in a similar manner, sending an item containing his DNA to a laboratory. Experts discovered a perfect match. The likely murderer was eventually located 40 years later, and the same year, on February 24, he was taken into custody. Although the man denied being involved in the murder, the evidence pointed to his guilt. Additionally, the suspect's fingerprints were collected by the police, and they matched those on the windowsill. After reading his biography, the detectives discovered a wealth of fascinating information. The man, who was 31 at the time of Robin's murder, resided a short distance from her complex. Wilson also frequently visited the donut shop where the victim was employed. This supported the police's initial theory that the murderer was the same unidentified stalker who had been bothering the young employee. The man's lack of a significant criminal record could account for the lack of his fingerprints and DNA in the databases. The lengthy trial preparations that followed his arrest continued for a number of years. Wilson and his legal representatives had already prepared a fresh line of defense by the time the process started in 2022. According to his attorney, Philip and Robin had a consensual relationship that evening, and then the man went home, and someone else broke into the young woman's apartment and killed her. Regarding the blood found at the scene of the crime, the suspect's attorney maintained that Wilson had cut himself while at work and that the wound had burst when he was at Robin's house. This version of events was deemed ludicrous by the prosecution. First of all, there was no romantic relationship between the victim and anyone. Additionally, she reported that Wilson was probably the strange man who was harassing her at work. His actions and persistence irritated the young woman, and they had no sympathy for one another. Secondly, the victim's apartment did not contain any additional male DNA traces. Assuming that Wilson left behind his DNA, blood, and fingerprints, while the murderer left nothing at all, would be bizarre. Moreover, the young woman contacted him voluntarily, if the suspect's attorney is to be believed, but not before she had made the bed, which was devoid of any bedding, for whatever reason. Additionally, Wilson's defense attempted to identify a different suspect as the potential murderer. It was the person Maria was living with at the time, her ex-boyfriend. The man was deceased at the time of the trial, and the attorney made use of this information. He made an effort to persuade the jury that the man was violent, had threatened Robin and her sister, and had broken into the victim's flat. Still, nothing was verifiable. Thus, none of these remarks significantly affected the legal system. Philip Wilson was consequently found guilty of murder. On his birthday, the news of his sentence was released. The man was given an indeterminate life sentence without the chance of release. Given his numerous health issues at the moment, his prison sentence is unlikely to be lengthy. The victim's family expressed gratitude to the detectives for concluding the case at last. After all, her sister acknowledged Robin moved to California to follow her, and she still feels guilty. Regarding the young lady Wilson had raped 3 weeks prior to the murder, the man was spared further punishment because the statute of limitations had passed. Detectives are still curious, though, if Wilson had any other victims. When criminals commit such heinous crimes, usually a few weeks pass between them. They do not stop and carry on harming people. Wilson may not have intended for her to die. After breaking into Robin's apartment and attacking her, she may have recognized Wilson's face from his frequent visits to her store. The man might have chosen to kill someone and then give up on committing other crimes out of fear of going to prison.
30 years old in 1986, Teresa Sacf, a compassionate nurse, was employed at Lakeland Regional Health in Florida. She cherished caring for her 8-year-old son, Jason, and helping others. As a single mother, living in a tiny apartment with her partner, Jason was her only family. Teresa always had a smile on her face, and she had green eyes and brown hair. She was a happy, outgoing person who made lots of friends both in her neighborhood and at work. She loved to watch movies, read books, and spend time with her son. She enjoyed learning new things and traveling as well. One day, she hoped to become a doctor and help save more lives. Teresa was alone in her apartment on October 15, 1986, a night when Jason was spending time with his grandmother Betty. Rain was falling heavily on that gloomy and stormy night. A man she didn't know broke into her house. He intended to hurt Teresa, and he carried a knife. His prints were on the windowsill and the doorknob. In addition, he had dropped a cigarette butt on the floor and left his DNA on it. He tried to push himself on Teresa and attacked her with his knife. Teresa used every ounce of strength to fight back. She attempted to defend herself with her hands, but he seriously hurt them. Because he was stronger than she was, he severely injured her throat. He killed her, leaving her body on the floor, then ran out of the apartment. When Teresa failed to arrive at work the following morning, Teresa's mother Betty became worried and went to check on her. Teresa's body was discovered in a bloody puddle. The police showed up at the apartment after she called them. From the crime scene, they gathered every piece of evidence and stored it for later use. Investigators interviewed a large number of suspects and pursued leads, but they were unable to identify the culprit, and the case was abandoned. Grady Judd, the Polk County Sheriff, finally declared the case solved on October 16, 2023. They were able to establish Teresa's injuries were caused by Donald Douglas. Douglas committed the crime when he was 33 years old. Along with his brother, he co-owned an electrical company. In 2008, Donald Douglas, then 54 years old, passed away from natural causes. It was made more difficult to link him to the case because he had no prior criminal record and was cremated after his death. Teresa's mother, Betty Sacf, and 2 of her sisters attended a press conference with Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd, who gave an account of how his department resolved the 37-year-old case. Donald Douglas, according to Sheriff Judd, lived directly behind the duplex. Investigators interviewed Donald Douglas and other neighbors when he lived right behind the duplex, but they never thought of him as a suspect. According to Grady Judd, Douglas had no visible wounds, and there was no reason for the initial detectives to suspect him. Judd surmised that Douglas killed Teresa because he wanted a relationship with her, but she turned him down. Judd clarified that in the early 2000s, the agency entered DNA from the crime scene into the FBI's national database, but due to technological advancements, no matches were found, indicating that the perpetrator's DNA had not been entered. After obtaining the case in 2015, Judd gave Detective Matthew Newbold credit for spearheading the effort to solve it. Teresa Sacf's picture was a permanent fixture on Newbold's desk, and he promised her family he wouldn't leave until he had found the criminal. Othram, a Texas-based business that specializes in creating genetic samples from crime scene evidence, collaborated with Newbold. With the use of publicly available DNA submitted by users of programs like 23andMe, the company assisted in building the suspect's family tree. Donald Douglas's third cousin, who had conceived a child outside of marriage in 1949, was the target of one hit. In the end, what Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd called the illicit affair revealed a new branch of the family tree. According to David Nutting, an official from Othram, it was the 106th publicly disclosed resolution to an unresolved case using Othram's DNA research. According to him, there are an estimated 330,000 unresolved cases in the U.S. When Douglas was found to be the culprit, the sheriff's detectives got in touch with his son and requested a sample of his DNA. He fully cooperated, Judd stated, and was mortified to learn that his sample confirmed that Donald Douglas's blood had been found at the crime scene. Teresa's sister, Pam, stated, "The first thing that I would like to say is Teresa was a wonderful person. The most loving person. She did not deserve it. Our family did not deserve this." She added, "She started off at the bottom nursing assistant. She went to respiratory school. She got her registered nurse license and was so proud. I've never seen anyone more proud." She said, "I did it, Pam. I did it." And she lost her life a month later after we had this conversation. I hope it gives everybody comfort to know that we now know who did this. I also would like to offer encouragement to other victims. Do not give up. Law enforcement does not give up, and as long as they do not give up, you do not give up. Lynn Scarf, Teresa's other sister, said that Teresa did disclose that she had some uncomfortable experiences with her neighbor. Although Teresa did not fully describe that neighbor, Lynn Scarf used Teresa's story as a warning to victims of stalking who are victims today. Teresa had told us about some creepy neighbor that had showed up at her house with what looked like he had yanked a flower up out of the ground and slapped it into a pot. He was sort of stalkerish, and she had told us about him, but she never described him to anybody. Especially ladies, if someone is being creepy, do not just tell your sisters, tell them what he looks like. Betty Scarf, Teresa's mother, spoke to the media and said, "All I want to say is I am 84 years old. I lived to see this done. I think that is why I lived so long." On September 4, 2012, at 5:35 p.m., Yonkers Police Department officers responded to a 911 call regarding a suspicious package discovered in the woods. First responders discovered a decomposing human body wrapped in a large black garbage bag when they arrived at the scene. After taking over the investigation, detectives from the department's Major Case Squad and Crime Scene Unit identified the victim as 26-year-old Pamela Gradick, a resident of the Bronx. In an effort to hide the crime, Pamela's killer had shot her twice in the head outside of Yonkers, according to investigators, and then dumped her in the woods. Early in the investigation, Wanda Vagila was marked as a person of interest by the police. She was Pamela's girlfriend, and they shared an apartment together. Wanda Vagila informed Pamela's family 1 month prior to her body being discovered on August 13, 2012, that although Pamela had vanished over the weekend, the things she was supposed to have taken with her remained in their apartment. Pamela's family reported her missing to New York City police when they discovered she hadn't shown up for work either. According to the investigators, the smaller Wanda Vigila could not have moved the larger Pamela's body from their apartment to the isolated spot in the woods. After a 2-year investigation, the case was turned over to the Yonkers Police Department Cold Case Unit because the investigators were unable to find enough evidence to bring charges upon anyone. In January 2022, Wanda Vigila, who was then 41 years old, was interviewed by investigators. In the course of the interview, Vigila admitted to killing Pamela. She claimed that because of their continuous domestic problems, she had shot Pamela inside their shared Bronx apartment. She claimed that John Torres gave her the weapon. Additionally, she had also moved the body from their apartment to the woods with Torres' assistance. Wanda Vigila and John Torres were both placed under arrest in March of 2022. Torres was accused of hindering and tampering with physical evidence, first-degree prosecution, second-degree criminal facilitation, and other felonies. After the arrests, City of Yonkers Police Commissioner John J. Mueller issued a statement in which he said, "The passage of time only reinforces our commitment to solving these heinous crimes. The Yonkers Police prides itself on focusing on victims and their families and doing whatever we can to deliver justice for them. I hope that these arrests bring some degree of closure to Pamela's family and friends. And I applaud the extraordinary efforts of our cold case detectives in closing out this case after so many years. Well done." Wanda Vigila was given a 20-year to life sentence in June 2023 for killing Pamela Gradick. In court, Tawana McClellan, Pamela's sister, said, "You took my sister from me. You took my sister from all of us, and I hope that burns in your soul." On May 11, 2007, 64 years old, Dennis Lee First was found deceased in his condominium in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had died from beatings and stabbings. Tammy Mimes, the assistant manager of the Hawthorne Hills Apartments, where Dennis lives, informed the police that he had prostate cancer. He had few visitors and lived off of Social Security. Tammy said she got a call from a friend asking her to check on Dennis, and she told the apartment's maintenance worker, Robert Gross. Robert knocked on Dennis's door several times. He entered the house after not hearing back. He found Dennis there, lying face up on the bed with his feet propped up on the floor. Robert called 911 as soon as he noticed there was a lot of blood. The evidence collected at the scene was carefully submitted for examination to the State Crime Lab of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Dennis's first wife, Christine Griffin, claimed that he had a challenging life. "It's unbelievable that someone would stab him. He could hardly get around." Dennis and Christine had 2 children. Their son Brad was born in 1963, and their daughter Laura was born in 1965. In the 1970s, the couple lived in Olin Jones County, where Dennis worked for the Monticello Steel Company as a purchasing agent. Dennis has lived in Cedar Rapids since the divorce in 1981. In 1990, Dennis was arrested on charges of driving under the influence and stealing from local businesses. Furthermore, he was accused of threatening a man whose room he had rented. After Dennis's son died in a car accident in 1993, his life didn't get any better. Dennis, who had initially lost contact with his daughter, his ex-wife, and other family members, started reaching out to them again a few years before he died in late May 2007. During the investigation into Dennis's death, Cedar Rapids police executed 5 search warrants. They looked through Dennis's apartment and also the apartment of a man named Curtis Paget, whom witnesses said must have had an argument with the victim. Curtis's fingerprints and a DNA sample from a cheek swab were gathered by investigators. Additionally, they took a pair of his boots from his apartment. Curtis Paget is also said to be a person of interest in an unrelated missing person case. He was the last person to have seen 15-year-old Erin Pospisil before she disappeared from Cedar Rapids on June 3, 2001. When the police questioned him at the time, Curtis mentioned that in 2001, having gone to visit Erin's elder brother, who was a friend of his, he and Erin departed the Pospisil family home, and he offered to give Erin a ride to her destination, which was her friend Brett's house. According to Curtis, on getting to Brett's residence, there was no one at the house. Shortly after, a black Chevrolet Cavalier with tinted rear windows pulled up to the curb as Erin was making her way back to his truck. Curtis said Erin went up to the car and had a quick conversation with those in it. Before getting into the back seat of the Cavaliers, she told Curtis that the guys in the car would give her a ride. Ever since Erin left her home with Curtis Paget, she has never been seen or heard from again. No additional witnesses have been found by the police to corroborate Paget's report of seeing a black Cavalier in the neighborhood. However, on March 1, 2023, 42-year-old Curtis Randall Paget was taken into custody and charged with Dennis First's murder. This specific case demonstrates the Cedar Rapids Police Department's commitment to the community and its victims. According to Lynn County Attorney Nick Maybanks, this incident shows the department's determination to bring victims' and survivors' rights to justice, even in cases where the general public may not be aware of them. After several months of investigation and a recent last meeting, Maybanks came to the conclusion that Paget was to blame for Dennis's demise. The reason Paget was arrested was not disclosed by the police, nor was it indicated if additional DNA testing was necessary after the department's cold case team approached them to assess the situation. Still, during the press conference, a partial blood boot print that matched boots discovered at Paget's house was disclosed. An oven mitt smeared with blood was also found. The oven mitt's interior contains DNA from Paget and Dennis. Additionally, Paget's fingerprint was found on a knife sharpener and in a drawer in Dennis's apartment. Since her sighting in the spring of 2002, Erin's case has not further progressed. Erin was spotted in a convenience store in Cedar Rapids. She was in an automobile with Illinois license plates in the back seat. Cedar Rapids police received this report, but the car was nowhere to be found. They have never been able to verify the sighting. The person who saw Erin is still positive that it was her because he was familiar with her. Erin's features describe her as a Caucasian female with dark brown hair and eyes. When Erin disappeared, her hair had red highlights and there was a small scar above her eye. If you know anything about her or the case, call the Cedar Rapids Police Department